Hey Collective, it's Al coming to you with another video that will be accompanying a piece I'm releasing on LinkedIn either this evening or early tomorrow morning, depending on when the video fully uploads onto YouTube, that basically responds to a question I had received relating to a previous post I had recently done, where I had made mention about the wealth of information available to the earthbound student that is seeking better guidance to understand the world events and things that are playing out around us. And essentially at the center of the piece, what I was doing was referencing the fact that there is a great deal to learn from the elders and masters and spiritualists and change makers and conscious leaders that have walked these halls before, and the breadcrumbs that they have left along their journeys to self-mastery that we can benefit by reviewing as a peer group and learning from so as to better navigate the seas of uncertainty that we ourselves are facing. And what I wanted to do with this particular piece was utilize two very distinct examples of what I was speaking to in a way that was both in written form and then followed up in a video form. Where in the written form, I had used the life of Nikola Tesla and the genius that he was and kind of the consequences that he faced before moving on to this video that would then center more on a group dynamic through Plato's work in the Allegory of the Cave. So in a nutshell, just to recap for those of you who are only catching this on YouTube, what I was referencing in Nikola Tesla's journey was a big philosophical, theological, and psychological question that was left in the wake of his particular journey. Because as you guys remember, Nikola Tesla was not only one of the most brilliant minds, but he was an incredibly altruistic human being. But one of the things that he suffered was that he thought that everyone else would always find alignment with right relations to the goals and aspirations that he thought were more divine. And what he ended up finding was that he ended up suffering the same Judas principle that even Jesus did in his own right. And what I mean by it is, as you guys can recall from the piece, I had noted that Nikola Tesla, towards the end of his life, had begun working on something that would bring free energy to the world. And as a result, he had sought funding from someone he thought would help him, that understood the greater mission, and that he thought was friend, who then turned out to be the person who most profited from charging for the same energy that he was trying to resolve as a free thing. And so in the end, he ended up dying paranoid and poor, and how I thought that that was one of the biggest injustices that I've ever seen, and how I could relate from a human being individualized expression of life, of what I've experienced in my own life, in betrayal and that Judas principle, and how it's a consistent through line through many stories of people who are change makers or people who are leaders or conscious developers, people who are part of the universal consciousness mind, and something that has been consistent throughout time. And the ending question that I left the piece in written form was, one wonders what would happen if that soul was ever brought back to the physical plane. And would that person, that soul, that energy, have learned from their previous mistakes so as to not make it again? And would they have become jaded by the scars that they accrued from that life experience and manifested into this life experience? Meaning not letting go of what was in the past and bringing such baggage and trauma into their new experience, right? And it was a great philosophical way to end it, because originally the last line was going to be, would we as a collective have learned from their journey so as to not make the same mistakes? Meaning not picking bad partnerships that we're not looking at in long-term importance, right? Because sometimes people will offer you a trap, meaning that they will offer you all of the funding that you need for a particular project so as to keep you as an enemy closer, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And had we as a collective really looked at that in terms of business, because as you guys know, a lot of the work that I've been referencing lately specifically deals to the ramifications of what we're seeing play out on a global level, where it is the partnerships and alliances that are bringing a lot of divine beings down. And so had we learned from it, and one of the best ways to speak to it indirectly was to speak to the life path of such a genius man who created everything that we now rely on. I mean, if you really look at our world, it's based on a lot of his blueprints and a lot of the work he did. But he never got to experience the abundance that comes from his own ideation and his own creations, because in the end he was betrayed and he ended up paranoid and dying very alone and in a very, very tragic setting. And so, but it led me to look at it from a perspective of what we as peers within the Great Earth Academy can learn from that. And had we experience such a betrayal in our own lives. And what I was connecting is, could we have avoided it by looking at the life of such a genius man and seeing that if it can happen to him, that we need to be more cautious in our right relations to whom we affiliate with and what their motivations are behind the scenes, right? Because though at the beginning it made sense from a philosophical and theological perspective that these two people might come together, one of the things that maybe Nikola Tesla didn't look at was the long-term trajectory of where he was going as an evolution of a soul. And that what he was trying to do was in divine alignment with a greater purpose. But was it then putting him in a juxtaposition with the person who was feeding him the money? Because then that basically is, bite the hand that feeds you and you're going to get a smackdown, right? So, but the bigger question on a philosophical standpoint led us to the greater question, which is what I ended up ending with, which was specifically speaking to what would happen if that soul ever came back to the academy in order to right wrongs? What would that look like? How would that play out? And would the scars of that be something that prevented him from healing from the trauma, right? Would that have carried through, or would he have been able, he, she, it, whatever the soul develops in, would they have carried that information forward, and would it be a shadow that is incredibly hard to bear? Because it would create a lot of trauma that may not make sense until they felt in alignment with themselves, right? And so it was a very philosophical, spiritual concept that ended the piece on a more high note, because when you look at souls like that, one of the things that we on this in the 3D do is that we tend to go to the pain that we ourselves hold and align ourselves with that ideation that he would be jaded. But what I find with specific beings like that who basically suffered the sacrificial lamb, where brilliant minds like those of Nikola Tesla or others who have been betrayed, and of course obviously the great and only Jesus, who suffered the Judas principle, and he was crucified as well. The idea that they would then come back to finish what they had started in some way, shape, or form, and what would that look like to the world at large? And would we then acknowledge who they are and help them complete their missions? And would we, as a collective consciousness, understand what it is that we were witnessing and why certain beings would be rewarded at the end of time, right? Because in order to balance the karma, not only would the worst of us have to be judged, but there would, in theory, have to be a rebalancing for the best of us, so that they would end in a place where they were rewarded for the sacrifices they had incurred. So it was a very philosophical question, but it was specifically geared towards individuals, like we as individual people. And the reason I had wanted to do that was to help you and I as peers within the great school, if you will, to better understand what the ramifications are in business relations or in personal affiliations and things like that. Because again, as we've seen, a lot of towers that are coming down, a lot of foundations that are being broken all the way to the core, are based not necessarily on the actions of the individual person that is the target, but is a bank shot where they basically go after them for the affiliations they have and bring them down that way. And so with us having possibly gotten ahead of the curve in previous moments, we could have probably helped those same people better understand it by looking at the life of Nikola Tesla, was the end result. But on a group dynamic, what I was left with was needing to then bring our attention to another concept that is also based on an elder, an incredibly brilliant mind as well, by the name of Plato, who spoke to something called the Allegory of the Cave. Because on a grand scheme, what people ended up probably feeling was a greater question about what this all means and how it all plays out, especially in a time of major transition like this. And since I had mentioned in the last piece that it was a group grading system, where it would be the peer group rising up, that I had made note of the fact that we needed to look at some of the more group dynamics that could play out as well, and how that would affect us if we would look at previous statements made by some of the more brilliant minds who seem to somehow speak to events that are now playing out in our timeline. And specifically what I was referencing was Plato in the Allegory of the Cave. Because Plato did something very philosophical and theological. He kind of broke a lot of barriers with the Allegory of the Cave. Because what he was actually speaking to was the idea of the academy itself in a very philosophical standpoint. What the Allegory of the Cave explores is the topic of what would happen to a group of people that were put in a particular situation where they were being puppeteered by people who were casting shadows upon the cave. And would they ever dare to leave the cave because that's all they had ever known? Or would they heavily rely on the manipulation of other things? But that's from a negative standpoint. But one of the things I find with that particular era, with Socrates and Plato and so forth, is they were having analytical discussions about philosophical principles that also bared fruit on the light side, meaning the bright side. You see, there's a big difference between what Plato was warning of and the truth of like the Great Earth Academy. And so it was something that we could explore as a group right now, and speaking to it very clearly. You see, in the Great Earth Academy hypothesis, if you will, you understand the major difference is that in Plato's Allegory of the Cave, the inhabitants of the cave have no freedom to escape it. They are at the mercy of the puppeteers who will cast the shadows upon them no matter what. And so there's no freedom to choose otherwise. Whereas in the Great Earth Academy, everyone has the freedom to choose the course of action that they do day to day. And it is in that free will choice that they either are blessed or face consequences. It's a learning vessel as opposed to a prison. So the big moral and ethical question that we as a peer group would then be facing is understanding the difference between the cave-like mentality or the cave-like setting of a school that is specifically engineered to your strengths and weaknesses in order to help you rise through achieving higher and higher levels versus the enslavement principle of what Plato was speaking to directly in the Allegory of the Cave. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is because I can't help but feel like there's familiarity in our own timeline, in our own experience, that screams of this particular conundrum, right? Because many of us are finding a lot of our freedoms being removed more and more quickly, and the race is starting to feel a lot more strangle-held, and we're finding ourselves in a very backwards stepping motion. And one of the things that I found interesting was the Allegory of the Cave and how hindsight is 2020, and how I was specifically thinking about the events that can transpire where, let's say, there's a philosophical conversation, it's a theory, but let's say a group of people try to seize power, and they try to seize power that is not theirs. And they take the idea of, let's say, the Great Earth Academy and turn it on its head by trying to then enslave the race through their own faith and their own principle in order to seize power to control because they know better than anybody else. It's their way. Essentially stepping into the pathway of playing God in the face of God, like kind of summing it up. Something that triggered me originally when this was coming up. But I thought about it and I was like, well, whatever you say about the events that happened recently, regardless of how it came to be, whether it was actually based on truth or whether it was manipulation, the one thing that we can't say is that the cave allegory doesn't, or the Allegory of the Cave doesn't befit this scenario in a philosophical context. Because what ended up happening is that since you can't have people in a cave, the events that transpired did bring them into an isolatory experience where the shadow was cast within the media that we had to rely on entirely. And it begs the question of where the authenticity was and what the moral grounding was of it. Because in the end, things that transpired during that phase have somehow begun to undermine the foundation that we ourselves are built upon. And so from an analytical standpoint, what I found myself looking at was, had we had the wherewithal and the foresight to think back to what Plato was speaking to, would we have chosen different pathways during that particular phase? Because a lot of what we're finding in this polarization is it is hyped up on pain, intolerance, and all of the worst part of humanity. And where did that come from? Why did that switch happen? And it happens to correlate around the same time. So could it be possible, from an analytical standpoint, that in the siege for power, some very corruptive influences, individuals who the great architect knows who they are, had done something unethical that broke treaties with the higher realms? And it was a very philosophical thing that I thought of in reflection when looking at the elders that have come before us and kind of the way that some people have exited the simulation and some of the costs that come with walking in divinity. And I have specifically warned everyone that's watching this to be very careful who you aim anything at this time. Because there is an incredible difference between serving something and then trying to take ownership. So the best way for scientific minds and people who are not in alignment with faith would better understand this principle and the idea is that there is a big difference between working within the paradigm of the simulation and understanding that there are laws that must be obeyed, that there are parts of the simulation that are structured there so as to not implode the entire thing, that if someone dared to try to take ownership of that simulation, it would run the risk of trying to enslave the race. Which, for those of you who are more faithful, might understand it better if I just said the war in the heavens. You know what I'm talking about. But you already know the ending, right? So those of you who are understanding this from a very spiritual context understand that the war in the heavens was already won. Anything playing out in the physical world would have to adjust to that timeline. So don't get lost in the illusions that have been cast, but understand that during that process, whether founded on rock or not, a lot of people became very dependent on a narrative that has not been honest with them consistently, right? It's very agenda-oriented, regardless of which side you're on, depending on what you were programmed to watch. You fell into a lull where for a very long period of time, it was just you or your immediate family and you did not see outside of the cave. You literally only experienced that entire trajectory in a cave setting. You were at home. And so what are the ramifications psychologically for what happened and how did that play on the fears of people, whether just or not? And could someone have tried to manipulate the masses into enslaving them? Because a lot of what we're seeing is the rise in dictatorship and in hatred and in intolerances, everything that breaks down humanity and the foundation of even some of our countries. So in reviewing this set of situations, what I realized is there's a lot that we are seeing play out that literally speak to either prophecy, whether true or not, because I've noticed that some people use people's faith in order to manipulate them, right? But we're not going to get into the whole conversation. But it pisses me off, but it's just something that's a strategy that happens all the time. But you can't take away someone's right to their free will choices. You see what I'm saying? So you kind of have to let people that are going to go down that path and be led into the bowels of hell. Sometimes you just got to go. I can't do anything right here. I'm sorry. I can't save you from your own choices, right? That's not what the Academy is about. But I started to think about the ramifications of what that would look like and what that might bring upon humanity. It's kind of like the one bad apple spoils the bunch. Because one of the things that keeps happening is people keep asking the higher realms, where are they? Why are they not involving themselves? And here's what I'm going to say from an analytical perspective of someone who is observing this from a far enough point where I can speak to it more elegantly. And it's this. Sometimes, no matter how much you love your children, you have to let them make the mistakes that they're going to make. Because in the end, if you are overbearing and you solve all of their problems, they learn nothing. And in the process, there is no need to then be in the familial dynamic. There's no need for the simulation to continue. If someone has to consistently save the experience, then it has failed as a simulation. And so to avoid that catastrophe, you would focus your energy better on the people who rise out of the illusion in time to make course corrections, in time to make it into their master's program or to develop within themselves the skill sets that they will need to thrive in the changing of the guard, if you will. And so it kind of solves the big conundrum on a philosophical, theological, and spiritual principle of like, why is nobody stepping? It's because regardless of the intention behind the cave allegory, whether you're on divine light or divine dark, no one forced anyone to do anything. It was free will choices that we as a collective participated in. And it was based in fear, but it was a valuable, it was a realistic fear that someone may have preyed on. Okay. But in the end, it's a free will choice that we as a collective participated in. And so there are consequences to the choices that we made. And it's why I said specifically that I judge not other people. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Because when people are afraid for their lives, I've said this for a long time, they sometimes do things that are questionable. And it reminded me of something that I spoke to with a really good girlfriend of mine recently, who happened to be at home one day cooking. And I'm just going to say this like this. She was at home cooking while her parents were in the media room, and she could hear the conversation happening on the screen. And it was the pastor for their particular denomination talking about the end times and the idea behind it, and he didn't really know what was going to happen because of the de-evolution that we were seeing play out. And the subject of taking the mark of the beast came out within the concept of it. And she turned to me, and very honestly, had said to me, what would you do? Because they say that if you don't take the mark of the beast, this is a theoretical conversation, don't everybody get all triggered all at once. It's just an analytical conversation for adults, for conscious leaders, and for those of you who are understanding what I'm saying. What would you do? Would you starve, or would you take the mark of the beast? Because she's like, I don't want to starve. It was playing on a fear of hers. And I said to her, I already answered this question. I chose to starve. And she says, what do you mean? And I said, well, during that whole period that we're referencing, that year and everything that happened that year, you guys have to remember that I didn't have any resources, and the mission I was sent on was to go into the heart of it and to experience it, knowing just on faith that I would be okay, and that I had no money coming in, but luckily I found a shelter, and I was able to make it without resorting to anything illegal or anything that somehow was counter my virtue. And I chose something that separated me, even though I didn't know that that was a byproduct of it. I just chose not the lesser of two evils. I didn't buy into the facade of what I was seeing, and instead went out into the world, and as many of you saw in my videos during that period, marched with Black Lives Matters. I went to the beach all the time. I developed very quickly in that because I was not afraid of whatever was the fear-mongering that was coming at me, because I just had blind faith in the great architect that I was protected. And so I chose the other option. And it reminds me of the lesser of the two evil argument that people say and when voting or whatnot, where they say, well, you have to pick the lesser of the two evils. And I go, I don't have to pick either evil, ever. I don't ever have to pick evil. Never. I don't have to sign off on it, ever. And it's one of those things that when you look at things from a philosophical and analytical standpoint, you come to understand in times of crisis, in times of transition, in times of chaos. And so the point of the overall piece is very simple. Regardless of how you feel about that particular era, it was a great methodology for someone, if they had decided to do something evil, to then try to manipulate the masses, right? Because they had them sequestered in isolation, and there was no sense of community, and people were very afraid. And so there was energy that could have fed off of that if it was, in fact, in misalignment. But if that was true, then the consequences that come from such manipulation, coercion, and all of that would be catastrophic to those individuals who participated in, and there would be no place for them to hide from the great architect, because they would in act be trying to live above the law of one, which is not acceptable in any universe, anywhere. And so as a school, what would then end up happening is it would have looked like a seize of power, a coup d'etat, if you will, where very corrupt people thought that because they don't believe in the great architect, that they could control everyone else, which would violate every term that there is in the universal treaties in this analysis. So what you would get as a result would be judgment. And it would be cast upon everyone equally because of the implications of the disloyalty to something that has already happened at a higher level. Okay? It's like, remember I had said that in one of my previous pieces, I wondered if we in the 3D experience were actually participating in the thought process, like a trains of thought that had a purpose, and that they were on a mission to resolve some sort of query on behalf of the higher realms. And I had made comment about the fact that regardless of whether you feel like you live in a simulation, or regardless of the fact that you believe in God, or regardless of the fact that you believe in whatever it is in science, there are still laws and guidelines that govern the well-being of the academy. And if someone seizes power to try to manipulate or enslave the race that was created so as to learn and have free will and freedom, that there would be severe consequences to that realm. And so we as a species would then need to be aware of what it is that we are seeing and why we are facing atonement, right? And that is not a castigation against any person, because if everybody have an incredible amount of compassion for people at all times. I don't judge another person, but from an analytical and philosophical, from a teaching perspective, it does raise the question of, well, the bombardment of all of the fear-mongering and all of the things, once seen through the allegory of the cave, leaves very little room for us to go, what the fuck are they doing? And in that transition, the fog lifting from us as a species, then creates an outcry at a higher level that the universe has no choice but to turn and observe. And it reminds me of that thing about sometimes what you do is you have to let people hang themselves in order to fully document what they have done, so that there is indisputable evidence of what they've been up to at the highest of levels, in order to formally open the gates to hell and cast them into the fire where they belong. That's a philosophical principle. It's a spiritual idea. I'm not telling anybody that that's what I hope happens to anybody. But what I'm saying is the insinuation to the allegory of the cave is that some people don't mean humanity well. And that makes sense, because some people get jealous over the simplest of stuff that makes no sense to me whatsoever. But people get jealous of skill sets or of ideas or of the way that someone looks or the way that they carry themselves. And I'm just like, but you can do all of the same things that they're doing. You're just choosing to not try. And so people then get triggered by that sentiment. You see what I'm saying? So there's all these little subsets. I create ripples just walking into a room. You should see the ripple effect that I created with the last post I did, with just the idea of us coming together and working with each department, working as one, in order to solve the problem that we're facing, in order for the simulation to keep going. And you should have seen the energetic backlash I got. It was fucking ridiculous. But, okay. But I told you guys, be careful who you send that energy to. Because at this particular time, there are a lot of questions in the air about things. And when you draw the attention of the realms I'm speaking of, there is no place to hide. They see all, know all, and they have been watching. So to those of you who are faithful, for those of you who are understanding the greater problem here, you're going to have to hold on to your faith that justice will prevail, regardless of the antics of whatever. Because in order for the simulation to go forth, they have to be held accountable for what they've done. And there's no place for them to run. But that doesn't mean that we're going to enjoy the experience of watching this play out. It reminds me of something I saw in The Trouble with Angels, which is one of my favorite movies when I was a kid. And Mother Superior is talking to one of the other nuns. And she says, you know, they said that the meek will inherit the earth, but no one said we would enjoy it. I just remember, for some reason, that just popped into my head. You see, there is a major conflict happening. But remember that some of the things that I've spoken to in the past, as we led into all of this, was I had spoken to a pathway in which timelines would collide between science and faith. And so make no mistake that there's a reason why I began this piece by speaking to Nikola Tesla's journey as a scientist and an atheist, and how that did not save him from the Judas principle that Jesus himself faced in his world. Two completely different people. Obviously, they're not the same person. I'm not equating that they are in any way, shape, or form. But understand where the betrayal came from. It was inside of their own house, right? And how they might have shadows to work through now, in order to fully resolve it and move the species forward in the theory that we're speaking of. Because the allegory of the cave basically speaks to people manipulating other people through fear tactics, through fear mongering, through hatred, through the darkest parts of humanity, in order to keep them separated and enslaved to an idea that is not factual. Because in the allegory of the cave, remember that the cave exists within a wider concept. Earth is not a cave, it's an academy. But even if it is an academy, it's built on free will choices and freedom to make mistakes that you learn from. But in the cave, there is no freedom. It is dictatorship, it is enslavement. It's preying on the fears and the vulnerability of other people who become so entranced into the illusion of what they are seeing that they forget that they are not the only world within the world. The cave does not just exist singularly. The cave exists within an environment, and that environment exists within a planet. And the planet, you see what I'm saying? So when we individuate too far, we can sometimes lose sight of the greater picture because we only see our own perspective. And so with the allegory of the cave, the best question that I could come up with was, what happens when the inhabitants of the cave become aware of the manipulation and that they have lost their freedom out of coercion, manipulation, and so forth? And had Plato been right to warn us all that time ago of this possibility? So regardless of whether you believe that era to be justified or you don't see any problem with everything that played out, there is a philosophical and theological principle about the difference between helping humanity rise and to grow and to evolve and purposely stopping it in order to hold on to assumed power that is not theirs to hold. And this is a really important part of the message for those of you who are getting what I'm saying. The ring of power should only be wielded by someone who doesn't want the ring of power. Okay? If you are pursuing power, then you won't find it at the higher level. Why would they give you something that they know you would corrupt immediately? Not you personally, but the people that would seek it out. So be aware that when people do that, they are dooming themselves to an ill-fated outcome. Because the people that are part of the allegory of the cave, the puppeteers, have to face the consequences of what they did, and it's going to be public. Because in their pursuit, they took away the freedoms guaranteed to the inhabitants of the academy, and they tried to seize power, acting in the name of a higher power that never gave them the authority to do this. So do not fear the backlash coming at you, because they're in such hot water right now that if they even make this, and this is just an Al statement, my belief here, if they even so much as look at the divine beings the wrong way right now, hell hath no fury like what will come down on them. Okay? You don't thumb your nose up at the great architect and try to seize his kingdom without facing the harshest of consequences. And you can try as much as you want to throw as many people into the fire with you. At the end, exactly who did what and where and what their participation was is all noted, regardless of whether I'm here or anybody else is here. Busted is the word that I would say. I'd said to you guys as an Earth, as an academy, be careful who you aim at right now. Because some of the teachers are dressed as students, and you don't want to step on those toes. Be aware of the allegory of the cave, not just on a personal level where you atone for the fact that it's not just your world, that you are part of a larger group, and that group is part of a larger community, and that community is part of a larger dynamic, nationalism, patriotism, all that stuff. Then that that grouping is then part of a larger system that is then part of a larger, do you see what I'm saying? So though you can get tunnel vision in your own perspective, don't lose sight of the grander picture, because the grander picture is completely at odds of what we're seeing. But don't lose faith. It's not that the great architect isn't completely aware of everything that's happening. It's that sometimes you have to let this run its course so as to fully be able to justifiably open the gates where they belong and send them to that place. But don't buy into this idea that you have to take the mark of the beast in that hypothetical situation in order to survive. Because, like I said to her, you're missing the point. I chose not to take it, and I was perfectly protected the entire time. It was not the most comfortable experiences. Being homeless at that period in time with no money, no welfare, no nothing, on the streets of Los Angeles with no friends, no family, no, was really a hard experience of a wilderness, if you want to ask, if you want the truth. But it was a test, right? It's part of the finals. It was part of my mastery or whatnot. I don't consider myself a master. I think that's ridiculous. I don't seek titles, but do you see my point? It was part of my journey. Let's go with that. It was part of my journey. But what I didn't do is I didn't become disloyal to my faith. Even though you and I may not have the same faith because we have different ideas of what faith means, I never ventured away from the great architect. You call him God, I never strayed from it. I just don't reside in some of the houses that you reside in for my own personal reasons. And one day, I mean, I've said them in written form. This is not the place nor the time to speak to why I don't affiliate with certain houses. But that doesn't mean that I didn't show full faith and that I didn't survive, right? So in your state of awareness, try to remove the emotion as much as you can. I mean, I don't know how you're going to remove the emotion, because if the light bulb goes off as to what we're talking about here, then you're probably going to be a little upset, either and misdirected at me, which again, warning, don't do that. Or you might just be angry about the scenario. Sometimes, in order to grow, we make decisions that we think will fulfill our needs out of an egoish thing. Meaning, let's say that someone is a really great, prolific writer, and they have an idea that would be a great television program. People who would have vested interest in sabotaging that might be the first people at the table, right? Keep your enemies closer. Or an entrepreneur that is doing something incredibly altruistic, something that builds a community of very like-minded, high vibrational people, might find themselves facing sabotage from within their own halls in order to enact a greater mission that would block them and give them like a bad taste in their mouth. It's a great way to deviate someone's life path, because the person just goes, well, if the universe wanted me to do it, then why would that have happened? And so when things like that play out, that's where faith comes in. It's where your spiritual center needs to be activated. And to understand that just because some people play underhanded doesn't mean you have to take that road. You know what I mean? You have to have faith. And you have to understand that the matrix, if it does exist, if the simulation that we live in is real, then you have to understand that it too has observed all of it. And in order for the simulation matrix, all of it to continue, all of these wrongs have to be righted. Otherwise, there's no evolution, right? If energies are trying to enslave the race and keep it from growing and keep it from moving on, then there would be no mission, or there would be no purpose for the entirety of it. You would just end it. You would just be like, well, they can't fucking figure this out. I'm not going to let this toxicity into the universe. You see what I'm saying? So understand that. So even if they were working, let's say, for dark energy, the dark energy knows that in order for it itself to survive, it has to sacrifice these energies. It has to. Because otherwise, if it keeps going, then that stranglehold continues on and that timeline cannot proceed. It doesn't grow, it doesn't do anything, it decays and dies out. But you can't think like that. That's a very pessimistic view on something that is not real. Remember, in the Allegory of the Cave, What they were betting on, the puppeteers were casting the shadows upon the people in the cave. And the cave doesn't have to be a physical place. It can be a mental place, where some people prey upon our insecurities, our depression, our fear, our loneliness. They feed off of that, and they make money off of our suffering, which is a crime in the high courts. And so just steer clear of those individuals, because they haven't been able to shut up. And they literally have just made it worse and worse for themselves each step of the way. So you know who they are. I don't care what the mind virus is that's going on. Be aware and conscious of the choices you're making and who you affiliate with, and understand at least the principle of strategy, right? Regardless of whether you agree or disagree that may have happened during that period where some corruptive people tried to seize power and control the masses. It doesn't matter in the end, as long as you understand that it is a possibility, as long as people are afraid and unconscious. And so the illumination of it is not to make people angry or to get triggered or whatnot, regardless of if you do or not. It's to be aware of tactics in the environment so as to not fall prey to that. When in doubt, seize information from your higher self and trust your intuitive quality to guide you. Don't be afraid of what they're doing. Work your own path. Look to the elders that have come before you when in doubt and see what you can glean from their journey. What are the breadcrumbs that they left you that could help illuminate the situations that we are experiencing as a peer group? Because I do really feel like this is a peer test. I just wonder, honestly, if anything would ever happen, it would be a miracle to me, is if the timeline of Jesus, the return of Jesus, and the timeline of the return of Tesla all happened at the same time. Now that would be, I would buy tickets to that, and that would be a very entertaining program. Right? To see the justice for all of the beings who died in the pursuit of divine purpose. Miracles can happen. So don't be afraid of understanding a higher principle. Be understanding that the dialogues and conversations that we are witnessing are resolving things that need to be resolved in order for the species to evolve. And if it does not evolve, it cannot go forth. It's really that simple. But for those I'm speaking to, whether you get triggered or not, you understand that you're not the problem. You may get mad at me, just don't direct it at me. You know what I mean? I'm not coming for you at all. I'm talking to a higher concept that is grounding its energy through us. Because we're going to need to heal each other. We're going to need to heal one another. And it's going to require unity and community, not conformity. There is a big difference between the two. Right? When you remove people's freedoms in order to enact your own personal vendetta against the world, or where you try to puppeteer other people into enslaving them to do your will instead of God's will, you are declaring war on the heavens. And we already know how this war ends. The heavens win, always. You know, the universe is not going to allow that type of behavior into the higher realms of consciousness. If you can't communicate, and if you have to do things in only shadow, and you can't stand in the light, then you can't go into the universe. If your creations are dark and evil, then why would you ever think you could get away with such things? So be advised of stuff like this. But that's what I meant about the wealth of information available to the students within the academy. And a lot of it has to do with faith. It's just being faithful. Remember, we live in one of the most beautiful academies to ever exist. It allows the soul to grow and prosper in real world settings where there is the physical weight of the choices that they make and the freedoms to make the mistakes that they need to in order to evolve. It's a beautiful thing. But when someone seizes power to then enslave the school, then the school itself will fight back. Take that as it resonates. But do not make the mistake of believing that these individuals or this particular entity is going to get away with anything. It certainly will not. And the consequences I hear are fierce. So stay true to your faith and stay true to wherever you are in the academy and where you need to be learning and growing. Don't look for vengeance. Look for compassion for each other, because everyone may have suffered the same manipulation, if you know what I mean? Or everyone went through the same levels of hell in order to raise above it. And now it's up to each individual to choose their own path. But at the end of the day, don't let them bamboozle you into believing that things are at the worst. Because like I told you, one of the things that's pissing me off is they're preying on people's faith to make them afraid to step outside the box. And that is a big no-no. I hope you guys have a blessed day. Thank you. Bye-bye.